we do? Do we change this law? We can't change this law because it's a precedent, and so there's a lot of it's just kind of up in the air right now. Kind of, I guess said simply, tiny houses just messed up everything as far as the current system in place. So, in my opinion, the best thing that could happen with tiny houses, from the experience in helping my sister finish hers and learning everything about all these legal hurdles that you have to cross that are very unique, just specifically to tiny houses. It is easier to build a conventional size house, far easier to do that than it is to build a tiny house when it comes to the legal hurdles. So, in my opinion, the best thing that could happen with tiny houses is if a new category of housing was created and defined specifically just for tiny houses. And I think that it should be called something like mobile accessory dwelling units. If placed on a trailer, the trailer would first have to be inspected by the Department of Licensing or respective state patrol to verify that the trailer is roadworthy, and from there, the construction side of things needs to be handled by local building inspectors and treated just as if it is a new construction home, and follow building codes for the International Residential Code, the IRC. And once completed, the tiny house would then have to go back to the Department of Licensing a second time to verify that the tiny house is within the weight capacity standards of the trailer and tongue of the trailer, and that the trailer is roadworthy. So that's what I think needs to happen. I think that would be the best thing in order for tiny houses to really get some serious traction, as if something along those lines occurred. So right now, every state and every county inside the state treats tiny houses differently. Some welcome tiny houses with welcome arms. Others make it impossible to have them and are downright hostile towards them. So, for example, Oregon and several counties in Oregon are extremely friendly to tiny houses, whereas Washington, just above Oregon, is really hostile, especially in the Seattle area. Most of all those areas have gone to extreme measures to make sure that tiny houses are impossible to build legally. So before you start building a tiny house for yourself, you need to realize that you need to dig really deep into your local community to find out what the local codes and zoning are, so you can see if it is even legal for you to build yourself a tiny house. It sounds ridiculous that it may not be legal for you to build something on your own property, but that's the way it is. If you build a tiny house for yourself, in most cases, the only way you will be able to live in it is if you also have a conventional size house also. The reason for this is that decades ago, maybe even a long time ago, I honestly haven't looked into when these laws were originally made, but it was a long time ago. So whenever residential building codes were being established, the government came up with a number of 600 square feet as the minimum size of a house that can be built in any given county. Why? Because they charge a certain amount in taxes per square feet for property. And anything below 600 square feet didn't provide enough income from taxes to support the local bureaucracy in order to manage the affairs of the county. In addition to that, at the time, whoever wrote these laws probably never imagined that people would want to live in anything less than 600 square feet. So they didn't think it would be a problem, obviously. So again, tiny houses turn that idea on its head. They come along, and because they are under 600 square feet in most cases, almost all tiny houses are under 600 square feet, they don't meet the minimum requirements to support the local bureaucracy. So that's another thing that's against them. So in my opinion, if the verbiage were changed to 600 square feet or less, rather than a minimum of 600 square feet, that people with tiny houses would be obliged to pay taxes for a 600 square feet home, even if their tiny house was half of that, so long as they were legally able to live on their own land. If I built a tiny house that was 300 square feet or 400 square feet, and my county said, oh, hey, it's under 600 square feet, it's not legal, I'd be like, well, hey, I'm totally willing to pay the taxes for a 600 square foot home. And so can we just list it as that, or is there something we can do? Because in order for me to stay in it long term, paying whatever fee or whatever it would be, or the taxes for a 600 square foot home is still going to be far less than any other option. So, one thing that is kind of the possible saving grace for tiny houses is also a law that was established a really long time ago. So something implemented in almost every county in the entire country a long, long time ago that every county has in common, or at least had in common at some point, and they've been abridged or amended as necessary as certain areas have become too populated. So, and these are laws pertaining to accessory dwelling units. So almost every lot or parcel allows one accessory dwelling unit, which is in essence a mother-in-law suite for family managed care. It is awesome to me, totally awesome, that whoever wrote these laws built it into nearly every county to enable this to happen. In densely populated cities, the zoning may not allow accessory dwelling units, while other counties in densely populated areas increase the number of allowable accessory dwelling units from 1 to 2. Several cities in California have done this. They do so for a couple of reasons. It is a simple way to solve a housing shortage, and it provides everyday citizens a means by which they can bring in more income by renting out one of their accessory dwelling units or both of them for extra income, such as a garage or a loft over a garage or a mother-in-law suite in the backyard. So, for example, I'm from Washington State, and I lived in Texas for a few years, and became friends with a really neat guy down there, and so he now lives in Salt Lake City, Utah, and so he gave me a call and had me look up some of the zoning for a friend of his who wanted to build an accessory dwelling unit. He wanted to rent out where he was currently living and then move into an accessory dwelling unit. And so in the Salt Lake County, an accessory dwelling unit in that county cannot exceed 600 square feet. It has to be 600 square feet or under. And then in looking at it, kind of looking at the grid and based off of public transportation, depended on whether or not you were allowed to build an accessory dwelling unit at all. And so if you were within a certain proximity to the different trams and trains that connect and intersect the city, then you can. And unfortunately, this guy was a quarter mile away from the sector that would allow him to build an accessory dwelling unit, so he was not allowed to do it. And so it all just completely depends on where you live. You have to look into it, and luckily every city that I've looked into makes it really easy to find the accessory dwelling unit regulation laws. It really isn't very hard to find them. So anyway, so moving on from there, if all tiny houses were recognized federally, on the federal level, as accessory dwelling units, then 90% of issues challenging the tiny house movement would disappear overnight. Only a handful of counties or states have chosen to recognize tiny houses as accessory dwelling units. Oregon State is the most friendly towards tiny houses that I know of. I know that Texas is also pretty friendly to them. Austin, Texas is especially welcoming, and they, as far as I understand, they treat tiny houses as accessory dwelling units. They recognize them in the city limits as an accessory dwelling unit. So right now, if you were to enter an internet search in Oregon, in Portland, you will find hundreds of people who are willing to rent out their backyard for anyone who has a tiny house. They charge between $300 to $400 a month for a place to park a tiny house, which is far below the average rent for an apartment. And $450 a month is equivalent to 30% of a minimum wage income. So it still falls within those parameters for being able to have a high quality of life. So if you build a tiny house and only after discovering afterwards that it is completed that you cannot legally use it in the state or the county where you built it, then I recommend taking your tiny house to a state that is friendly to tiny houses and either move there yourself and live in it, or rent it out, or sell it to someone who is interested in doing one of those things. Alright, so if you are planning to build a tiny house, I recommend contacting and partnering with a local certified RV manufacturer and have them build you the minimum tiny house. Basically, a tiny house that has all the minimum things completed, so that Labor and Industries or the RV certification codes that are in place in that state, can basically check it off. So the RV manufacturer will basically be building you a bare bones tiny house, and that way it's more affordable for you. And as far as I know, most tiny house companies that are RV certified are totally willing to do this. And then from that point, you finish it and push it to completion and put in all the finishes and all the finished carpentry and such to customize it to the particular look that you're looking for. If you pay a certified RV manufacturer to do that, then the expenses are pretty high. Just in order to, a lot of these machines, they have a lot of overhead to cover. They've got to cover their manufacturing facilities and all the different inspections. And so if you can have them build you a bare bones tiny house and then you customize it yourself, it's the closest thing you can do in order to have an affordable tiny house. And in doing that, you will be able to have a lot more liberty and a lot of freedom for what you use it for. You could actually rent it out. So long as it has a state-certified insignia on it, then you can rent it out to other people as well. So if this is not an option financially, you can always build a tiny house and cross your fingers that your local authorities won't crack down on you, the same way that they aren't cracking down on the trailer park down the street that has dozens of people living full-time in RVs. So you could do that. A lot of people are doing that right now, but it is definitely risky. So I recommend contacting your local building inspector, telling him or her what it is you are hoping to do, and enroll them as a team member and get them on your side and ask them their help and advice in how you can, in what you need to do and how you can succeed. The last thing you want to do is establish a versus match between you and a local building inspector. So, especially in smaller counties where there's only one local building inspector, unfortunately they have a lot of power in their respective communities, and for some of them, it's almost like dictator-esque when it comes to what you are allowed to build, and so if you become enemies with them, then you can very quickly disqualify yourself from being able to do anything. So, for the first 2 years of our marriage with my wife and I, we lived in a single-floor small house. It wasn't a tiny house, but it was a small house that was 17 feet on one wall and 20 feet along the perpendicular wall. So in all, including a storage closet, it came to 398 square feet of living space. So in having lived in that small of a footprint, which is very comparable to a tiny house, I can honestly say that the only thing that we lacked that would have made it entirely comfortable and practical for us was to have a exterior, detached storage unit that was maybe 8 feet by 12 feet for things like winter tires, tools and rakes, etc. Basically things that you would need, even like storage space you would need even if you're living in a conventional sized home. So, this is just me personally with the different viewpoints I have for tiny house communities moving forward. If tiny house communities are going to start being built, is basically where tiny houses are attracted to these communities in only tiny houses, similar to how mobile homes have their own trailer parks, and then RVs have their own, that tiny houses would have their own. I personally think that in order to maintain a high standard of quality, that I think that they basically need to be set up the same way as a homeowners association. I think that most people hate homeowners associations because they really do limit what you can do. They limit, depending on how stringent they are, you are limited to a very narrow selection of paints and roof materials and all different types of things. And they do this as a way to basically establish a standard of quality so that nothing ever looks run down and everything looks really, really high quality. So in a similar way, perhaps with more leeway and more freedom, that tiny house communities be set up in a similar way, where there are some very specific things in place for what is allowed on each parcel or property in order to keep things looking very nice and beautiful. And so, for example, in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, my wife did one of her internships there. She was an interior designer, and so she studied there, and with a custom interior design company, and so she got some experience in that area. And there is a vast array of architecture and architectural styles in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, but they are very, very careful and selective on what is permitted to be built. And so I think that they've taken a really good approach because they allow a wide array of styles and a very, very broad spectrum of different architecture styles and things like that, and materials and things like that. But regardless of the style and the materials, there is a standard of quality that is still met and still established, and that is preserved. And as a result, the entire city is very beautiful, and it's really appealing. And it's some of the most expensive real estate in the country as a result. I personally think that in order to set a high standard of quality and cleanliness for tiny house communities, that things should be organized similar to a homeowners association type of way, and establish that any lots or parcels that have tiny houses on them should allow one tiny house, a storage shed up to 80 square feet, and a 2-car carport that all match the same construction style and have matching or complementary materials as the tiny house, so that it's all, at least for each unit in each property, that there's a cohesive style. That's just me personally. So the Collaborative Tiny House Project, which is what I'm still associated with, is working to develop a curriculum for high schools that enables these high schools to build tiny houses in a shop class that provides them an English and math credit. So that's basically like our goal. And so all the information, all the different things that we've learned has been in doing everything we can to make this possible. So there are 3 steps that we've identified in this process. So we have completed step 1, which is to create an all-inclusive, comprehensive set of tiny house plans that are super, super detailed, so that high school students that have 0 previous construction experience can successfully build a tiny house. So this was really challenging in order to make a set of tiny house plans this detailed, so that they could specifically be used for this curriculum. So we partnered with Seattle Tiny Homes to develop the set of plans. And these set of plans, because they are so detailed, they are available to anyone. You can check them out at Seattle Tiny Homes. But we made them specifically to meet the need of this curriculum. And so this set of plans covers the framing, the electrical, the plumbing, propane, and the HVAC systems. It covers everything, and it outlines how to do every single thing really clearly. And so I've drafted homes before, residential homes. So a typical residential home, depending on your county and the different regulations that they require when you're drafting, are between 12 sheets and 17 sheets for the houses that I've drafted and designed. And so, so this tiny house plan, because it is all comprehensive for every single one of those systems, it's almost 100 pages, which is kind of puts that in perspective for how detailed it is. So now that step one is completed, we are moving on to step two, which is partnering with different educators who want this curriculum in their schools, and developing this curriculum. And so this is what we're doing right now. So we're in step two right now. So step three is something that we identified from the school that built the tiny house that my sister purchased. And so step three is for schools to take ownership of one of the demographics that I explained earlier in the presentation and form relationships and partnerships with government agencies, local charities, or local businesses so that schools have someone who wants their tiny houses before they even begin building their first one. The greatest challenge to a tiny house program, to being able to perpetuate itself year to year, is the school's ability to sell the tiny house that the students make each year. And so the way that the school functioned that my sister purchased the tiny house from, it only ran for 2 years. And so the first tiny house was built, it was a 2-story tiny house, and it followed the International Residential Code. And there were a lot of challenges associated with that regarding inspections and different things like that really made it take a very long time. And so they learned a great deal from that. And so the second year they decided not to go through the International Residential Code using conventional construction techniques, and instead they chose to go the tiny house RV route where it's on a trailer. And that's the one that my sister purchased. And so the most difficult thing that they came up with is that the school had to pay for all of the materials for these tiny houses. And at the end of the year, they had to sell them at cost in order to have enough money to build one the following year. And if they did not sell them, then there goes the program in just 1 year. And so there really needs to be someone who wants the tiny house before they even can implement these programs, or else they'll be very short-lived shop programs. So by identifying a housing need in a community and committing to the needs of that specific demographic, schools can provide an incredible service of not just providing an excellent learning experience for its students, but also alleviating a housing need in the local community by means of its tiny houses. So it really can be a very, very mutually beneficial thing. It benefits the students, but it also benefits the local community, because that community has specific demographics that need these tiny houses for all kinds of things. And like I said, those needs can vary greatly. So, for example, in Moscow, Idaho, which is near Spokane, Washington, which is where I'm from, Moscow has adjusted their zoning to make tiny houses count as accessory dwelling units in the city, but only specifically to be used for mother-in-law suites. I think that they kind of see, this trend that's approaching, where there's going to be a much greater need for family managed care, and so they've already situated themselves as a city to kind of cater to that, which is pretty remarkable. And so if there are a demographic like that, particularly say if we use Moscow, Idaho, for example, then you could form a partnership and a relationship with those with those communities that are catering to providing this housing for mother-in-law suites, and the schools can be like, hey, look, we will build you a tiny house every year, that will be used for this. Will you buy it at cost? And so long as they, follow all these different regulations, and if they followed the plans that we made in partnership with Seattle Tiny Homes, then, across the board, they would be able to use these tiny houses as they follow the RV codes to a T. And so in order for tiny house programs in schools to really be realistic, these partnerships have to be established. If I were to ever personally take ownership of a particular demographic, the one that resonates most with me is veterans. That I think that's the demographic that I would be able to most passionately sink my teeth into and be able to commit to moving forward. But for each school, they would, and the leaders and members of the school, they would basically have to do that and look at the demographics and be like, okay, which one of these demographics can we be passionate about really committing to help? And so tiny house programs in schools really are a way to really unite communities entirely. In my particular home community where I grew up, in eastern Washington, there are a tremendous number of sawmills. There are at least a dozen within just 1 or 2 hours away. And so the lumber necessary to build a tiny house is super minimal. It hardly needs any lumber at all. And so what our school should have done was we should have opened it up to the community completely, because so many of the people who lived in our particular community work in these different sawmills. They were millwrights. They do all these different types of things. And so if a school were to open up this program to the community and be like, hey, we need this many 2x4s, we need this many 2x6s, these are the materials that we need, this is how much roofing we need, between local businesses and different companies like that, I think that it would be very easy for all of these companies and all of the community members and the parents to be like, oh, totally, let's get this done, because not only is this going to provide an incredible education for our children, but this tiny house is then going to go directly to serving a need in our community, like right here. And so tiny house building programs in schools really can be a phenomenal way of uniting the community without even creating much of an investment on the part of the school. So, another thing that I think would be really beneficial to any schools that do implement tiny house programs in their shop classes is to have local plumbers, electricians, and different professionals come into the school when it's time to start working on each one of those systems, and have those professionals explain how to do it, and so that way they can help a little bit, and that way it would be invaluable for the students, but also a good experience for these different workers, because in a lot of cases these students who work on these tiny houses may find an interest in one of these trades and may choose to go into that as a vocation. And so I think by bringing in community members that have these skill sets, that it could be remarkably beneficial for everyone involved. So, in conclusion, for anyone interested in helping us make progress with the curriculum for the tiny house project, the collaborative tiny house project, please visit the collaborativetinyhouseproject.com to get involved, and we'd love any help, as everything that we're doing right now is volunteer. And so any insight or anything that you would love to participate or contribute would be highly welcomed. And so, in conclusion, in order for the tiny house movement to gain momentum and gain ground with local codes and hopefully even financial backing from banks, there has to be a high standard of quality that is established so that cities are not threatened by tiny houses the same way that they are threatened by RV parks or mobile home parks. If tiny houses fall in the same category, then they will be outlawed from city limits and pushed to the outskirts of cities the same way that trailer parks are, and if not further. So in whatever you build, I ask that you work hard to build things that are beautiful and impressive. Make tiny houses that are gorgeous and that really are a very incredible statement of craftsmanship. Please do your best to incorporate the highest level of quality in any of the tiny houses you build. And if you attach them to trailers, make sure you attach them to the trailers really, really well. If a tiny house is being pulled along the highway and it falls off the trailer, then that probably isn't going to, benefit the movement in general very much. It could lose some ground really quickly. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining me for this presentation. And I'm really grateful for the Tiny House Summit for inviting me to be a keynote speaker to share some of this information. And again, if you're looking to build a tiny house for yourself, I highly recommend looking into local codes and building codes and zoning that are specific to your area and your situation. And if you're looking into getting involved with meeting a housing need in your community, then I highly encourage you to start forming those relationships. Something that is really unique to the tiny house industry in general, especially for each of those that were invited to be keynote speakers in this summit, is that all of them are very, very open with the information that they've developed. They don't hold any of this information close to their chests. Everything is very, very shared very freely and openly, because all of these people believe very strongly in the movement and they want it to succeed. And so if you have any questions, you can touch base with me or any of these other professionals, and we will do everything we can to share as much information as we can so that you can be empowered to succeed with whatever project you're doing. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and if you enjoyed this presentation, please recommend it and share it with your friends and family. I really appreciate your time, and hope to see you again. Thank you.